Thank you for joining our ITE Industry Council Product Showcase today. My name is Pam Goodell, and I am the staff liaison for the ITE Industry Council. Before we get started, I want to provide a brief background on ITE, the ITE Industry Council, and the Product Showcase webinar series, as I know many people here are not ITE members and may not be familiar with the organization. ITE is a membership organization of more than 16,000 transportation professionals, including engineers, planners, consultants, educators, its students, and more, who want to improve the mobility and safety for all transportation users and help build livable communities. The Industry Council is one of ITE's 3 employer councils, the Consultant Council and the Public Agency Council being the other 2. The goal of the Industry Council is to help educate the public sector and transportation consultancies on existing, new, and emerging solutions. The Industry Council has issued several briefings papers, the most recent on the impacts of working from home on transportation organizations and employers as a result of COVID-19. The Product Showcase webinar series is one of the opportunities also afforded to Industry Council members to accomplish the goal of education. It is a venue for organizations such as PTV, one of the founding members of the Industry Council, to demonstrate the products that they offer, and show how they have real-world applicability. I would like to now introduce Bill Cisco of PTV, who will be talking about the next evolution of traffic impact analysis. Take it away, Bill.
Great, thank you, Pam. Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. So again, my name is Bill Cisco. I am with PTV Group. You see the topic here, next evolution in transportation impact analysis. We're gonna look at PTV Vistro. We're gonna look at the ITE Trip Generation 11 app, and also what is new with the HCM 7th edition. All right, so we'll start looking at the agenda. I'm going to do a brief introduction of myself here in just the next slide. Then we'll get into a background. I know that a lot of you may already know some things about Vistro. Many of you may have heard about Vistro but have not seen it in action. And so before jumping in directly to how it integrates the trip generation data, it really makes sense to do a background of what the software is, how it functions, and so forth, and then we'll switch from the PowerPoint at that point in the webinar over to the software, and we'll do a live demonstration. In the meantime, Pam may have typed this in, but if you have questions as we go, feel free to enter those in the question area, and we will get to those at the end. That's our kind of reserving time towards the end of the webinar to be able to answer your questions at that point. All right, well, again, my name is Bill Cisco. I am a principal transportation engineer at PTV Group. I am based in our Portland, Oregon office. My background professionally is I was a transportation consultant for 17 years in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay areas of California. I have been working in the software solution industry, if you will, for over 8 years now, and then also had a couple years where I was working at a firm that deals with applications of connected vehicle data and how that relates to traffic engineering. Also, I'd like to point out that I am a member of the TRB Highway Capacity and Quality of Service Committee, and I currently chair the Interrupted Flow subcommittee of that. And that subcommittee deals with the components that Vistro implements from the HCM methodologies. All right, moving along to agenda item 2, what is Vistro and how can it be useful in your transportation analysis? Okay, otherwise known as what it is and what it does. So just as a little background, if you haven't really seen Vistro in action, at its core, it does intersection operations analysis, but it also has a whole workflow component that deals with traffic signal optimization all the way up to the network level or corridors or individual intersections. We're not going to really touch on that today, but we have a lot of resources I can point you to during the Q&A as well. Today, we're going to focus on the TIA functionality and how Vistro has this integrated, complete tracking of trip generation, distribution, and assignment for new development projects. And yay, our newly announced ability that we have this API now through our work with ITE to be able to draw in the ITE TripGen data directly in that format. Also, we'll talk about how to manage scenarios within the software and how that really is critical, of course, when you're doing an impact analysis, as there's many different development scenarios to keep track of. We'll take a quick look at our comprehensive reports, including our really nice built-in graphical reporting. And also just to remind you that our Vistro software is a perfect platform if you're going to then need to do simulation on certain projects, as it ties into, of course, our vSim microsimulation software. All right, so just a few use cases here in terms of what you might be able to use Vistro for. The fourth one on the first row is what we're going to focus on during the live demo, but of course, any type of existing conditions or congestion monitoring, we have agencies that are using it for that. Multimodal we'll touch on a little bit. So we do have the ability to also analyze pedestrians and bicycles, and a little bit of transit in there we'll talk about. Signal optimization, TIAs, I talked briefly before. We have a little bit of signal warrants to help you as you're estimating what type of mitigations you might want to include. And then corridor studies, a place to store your data, it can be used for that as well. And then our mix and match, or ways that it ties into our whole suite of travel demand modeling and microsimulation software. All right, just a little background on the types of calculations. I know I mentioned we're going to talk about some of the stuff that's new in HCM 7th edition. That will come a little later after the live demo, but I do want to highlight that we have that method in. It's been released by TRB officially in January in electronic form, I think recently in paper form, so look for that if you haven't already purchased it. Lots of great stuff in that. We also maintain the older versions, so if you have projects that are ongoing or agencies that require you to perform your HCM analyses in, say, 2010 or 2000, you can still do that in Vistro. What's nice in Vistro, we have a lot of ways for you to localize your data, so you can adjust the saturation flow rates, for instance, if you did a sat flow study and had final values instead of having the calculated values. So that's one example. The other thing I want to highlight is we really don't have any constraints when it comes to signals. You can analyze all kinds of different things, approaches that include both shared and exclusive turns. You can have 8-leg approaches, NEMA or non-NEMA phasing, and the RBC ring and barrier controller. So if you're familiar with our vSim software, it's a scaled back deterministic version of that, where you can have up to 4 rings and 8 barriers. So it's a very flexible, and you basically the fourth bullet here, I think, that we can analyze all kinds of intersection configurations, and you're not going to get an error message produced that tells you it can't do it. That is available. If you're north of the border, we have the Canadian Capacity Guide, and if you're more planning level applications, we have 2 different ways to do that, through ICU or Circular 212. And also like to highlight, our software does what is in the HCM intersection level V over C. It's not in every software, it is in ours. And for roundabouts, you can use the HCM method, but also a Kimber method, which is a UK-based option. Just a little bit about the multimodal aspects, because of course, as you're doing your TIAs, there may be more and more. The name has changed from traffic to transportation to be more inclusive of other types of modes. In Vistro, we do implement the HCM methods to actually analyze pedestrians at signalized intersections. So that includes pedestrian delays, as well as the various density values for crosswalks, as well as corner circulation areas and that type of thing. And more we're seeing ped-friendly signal phasing options out there, like of course exclusive ped phasing, or perhaps a leading pedestrian interval in a more urban core area. And in our lingo, we call that a delayed vehicle green, and you don't have to have a special hold phase that you code. It's just a direct entry in the software to analyze your signals, as well as all the options for PED recall, push buttons, et cetera, that you can see on the list on the left side of the screen. From a bicycle analysis perspective at Signals, we also implement the bike MOEs. So there's a bicycle delay and there's bike sat flow and V over C and that type of thing. We also have agencies that are using Vistro to actually model and evaluate bike specific signal head phasings and cycle tracks. So those are things, all of these we've done a series of webinars PTV has as part of what is called our PTV Talks program. Later on, hopefully I'll remember to throw that link in there. But basically it's pretty straightforward. We have a lot of options available for you to see things after the fact with any questions that you might have. And in fact, what I'm going to do is, before I forget, ptv.to/learn is our quick shortcut to the, I'm gonna make this available to, send chat to organizers and panelists, ITE, or staff. I guess I can't send it to everybody. All right, Pam, maybe you can help me figure that out before the end of the webinar. I'll send it to you right now, and maybe you can forward that on later on. All right, at any rate, let's move back. Transit, you can also, of course, you can always with HCM look at how transit affects automobile saturation flow, but now we have ways that you can, from a deterministic level, we have resources available for ways that you can do some planning level evaluations of some different types of transit treatments. So just to know, all those, while I'm mentioning them specifically as evaluation methods, those can be built into ways that you look at with and without project trips, right? So definitely applicable in a transportation impact analysis setting, such as the topic for today. And then in terms of just the way that we do things in Vistro is very user-friendly, top to bottom, left to right. And this is just a quick example of that. We're gonna go live in a little bit, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but it guides you through the process from setting up your network to putting in your volumes to entering your signal data and starting to see your results like you see on the right side of this screen. I want to take a minute to talk about scenario management. I called that out as a bullet point for this whole webinar because, of course, as we think to do our transportation impact analyses, it always pays to think ahead about all the different types of scenarios that I need to analyze. And so, of course, you have in your project case, it may vary depending on your local jurisdiction or state DOTs, TIA requirements in terms of exactly what type of scenarios that you need to analyze. But a little bit of thought at the beginning helps to lead to a lot of efficiency on the downstream end. Or put another way, if you think ahead and plan ahead, which most of you on this call are probably planners, and so I'm preaching to the choir, it will help you from having a lot of heartache later on by having to redo things. So what I do want to point out is when we go live, I'm going to look at scenario management and look at how Vistro treats this very special scenario called a base scenario versus the user-defined scenarios and how we can use those two together to its maximum power. Also, though, not just from a TIA perspective, but as shown in this screenshot, we may have cases where we're doing a corridor signal optimization analysis, and you might have various scenarios that where you want to maintain your existing timings and offsets and so forth, and then have an additional scenario that you create prior to running your optimization. So basically, anytime your geometry changes, anytime your volumes change, anytime that your signal timings change, you will create a new scenario or duplicate an existing one and modify it. And all of that can be stored within one file. And we have some nice tools to help you kind of in mass do some modifications to things like add growth factors for, you know, a certain scenario and that type of thing. When it comes to TIAs, just quickly, where I circled in red is where in the software you do your trip generation, distribution, and assignment. We're going to see that live, but a couple quick screenshots to show that, you know, in Vistro, you are adding these trips in, and I'm going to show how to do that directly through the linkage to ITE's TripGen11 app. Once they're in Vistro, then you are going to be assigning these trips based on entering some distribution percentages and some very specific path drawing and path percentages, so that you can assign your project trips very precisely into and out of every project driveway that you may have. And you, as the engineer or planner, will have complete control over how that assignment takes place. The strength of Vistro is in its trip accounting. So as you set things up in the software, all of the repetition that occurs through assigning those trips and having it show up at every turning movement throughout your entire network is something that you can do visually in the interface, and the software keeps track of all that, and that really shows its power in two forms. One, when you have multiple sites and you need to eventually look at who's responsible. Okay, I'm old enough where all my references now are not current, but I'm sure we have some Seinfeld fans in the audience, and one of my favorite lines is where Jerry says, he pontificates, you don't want to be responsible, because somebody comes in, there's a big mess, there's a problem, and they say, who's responsible, right? It's like, who's responsible? Well, how about I have 3 different developments going on? Who's responsible for how much money needs to be added to provide for a certain mitigation measure? Well, all of those trip tracking that Vistro is doing internally makes it very easy after the fact to see a % fair share contribution, for example. And I know not every agency uses that approach, but it's a pretty standard one, and we make that pretty straightforward. All right, let's see. We'll move on, and site specific trips, we'll get into that later. And just the last thing on optimization is, if you have a corridor that has a bend in it for whatever reason, maybe it's a one-way street, a two-way street that then heads off with the one-way in the opposite direction, as you see on the far right side of the screen, you can define your optimization routes in this this route format, or what's generically called a path-based optimization. A little sample of some of the reports you can expect out of your transportation impact analysis that you do in Vistro. The third one is the most interesting, preset visual graphical reports with the intersection circle or bubble diagrams. This one shows the lane striping and traffic control device, but we'll see later we have those for every single version of your volumes, from existing conditions to background to project only, and so forth. And lastly, on the reporting side, when you have your network, you can post a lot of great visuals and then take screenshots, if you will, such as this. Here we see turning movements next to the arrow. The next number after that is the phase number, or what we call a signal group in PTV nomenclature. And then in the various colors there are your movement delays, color-coded by severity. So yellow, orange, and then to red, green in some cases as well. All right, so that leads us to a background. Hopefully that gives you a good understanding of what Vistro is and what it can be used for. And now let's go ahead and take a look at applying live in the software, setting up some scenarios where we're going to look at adding some project trips and using the ITE Trip Generation app through our API that we co-developed and is available within Vistro. All right, so with that, I'm going to temporarily escape out of here, and I need to close my Outlook, and so we don't get interrupted. Let's go ahead and go to a file here in Vistro. I'm going to briefly check and make sure from the audience view that this is being shown. It looks like it is, so we're in good shape. This is the Vistro interface. On the left side is my model network has the integrated Bing map. And then on the right side are all of my intersection or other types of data. And let's say I'm about to do an impact analysis for a plot of land that I'm kind of hovering over. I'm going to zoom in a minute. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about scenario management. So at this point in time, to simplify things, I'm only going to look at PM peak hour. Now, typically in our TIAs, of course, we may do AM, PM, depending on the land use, we might have midday or Saturday. But in this case, I'm going to focus in only on PM for the purposes of this webinar. And you can just imagine how that would just perpetuate, propagate, I guess is the better word, for other time scenarios that you may need to do. What I will highlight is in Vistro, when you first begin, there will always be something called a base scenario. That base scenario is very special, and it is something where you will build your network and you can enter pretty much everything from one of your existing conditions data, in this case PM. I can enter all my lane striping, my volumes, my timings, my other type of traffic control information, where are the stop signs, which approaches, etc. And then once I'm ready to move beyond, then I will duplicate that base scenario. Well, actually, I'll create it with this plus button. We'll create my first user-defined scenario, in this case, my existing PM. We have webinar recordings on that link that I'll give you if you want to visit. We have, I think, 11 or 12 different hours worth of Vistro webinars that you can watch to your heart's content that go through a lot of the stuff that I'm not going to show today. But once you have your existing PM, and then you start to think about what else am I going to need for my TIA. And in this case, we're going to look at a couple scenarios. One, where I want to account for some near-term traffic. So traffic that will be there the day before my project opens, basically. So I want to have all my existing data, but I also need to account for another nearby project in the area. And then I want to evaluate conditions under that situation. And then I want to go in and add my project information. So we're going to start today already at the point where I have scenario 2, which is what is called, what I label as near term. Again, this may be different. You may be in a jurisdiction where you need to also look at existing plus project. That's not a problem. I'm not going to show that today, but what you can do is in a minute, I'm going to add a duplicate from this near term case and add my trips on. But what you could do instead, if you have to show an existing plus project, is simply duplicate the existing scenario and then have the trips added onto that. I'm going to go the more traditional way, where there's an intermediate level where I have to account for some other traffic, maybe even some growth factoring. So one thing, as you pick your scenario in Vistro, you always want to look at this white box and get in the habit of that, because whatever I'm going to edit right now will be directly affected in this white box scenario only. So if I'm not careful, I might find myself adding AM timings to a PM scenario, right? But usually we can deal with that. But just as a little tip, always look in the white box. What I do want to highlight here is what makes this scenario, why do I need this scenario? So I kind of talked about that in general, but in this case, let's just look here for a second that I have a project that I'm going to add in the next scenario, but I also have a project that's been approved by the city nearby. And this is the project assignment for that approved project, and I need to account for that in Vistro before I layer on my own project trips. And then secondly, I might have some background volumes that I want to account for. And in this case, my count data was a little bit older, so I wanted to bump that up by a growth factor by the time that my project will come on board. So this is basically a growth factor 2% per year, and I can apply that throughout the whole network, no problem, through some multi-edit, multi-change features that we have. And then the other thing that I can do is account for this other project's development trips. And that's pretty straightforward. It is more user-defined entry. We'll see some trips coming in and out of this intersection, and then I spread them throughout my network. And those get added in a line called in-process volume. So I just add those in directly into that line, and then my volumes will accumulate from my count and multiplying the growth factor and adding those in-process trips. A lot of places call them approved. In Oregon, they're called in-process, and that was kind of the nature of that nomenclature. But either way, I think you get the picture. We're building up a scenario where we're taking existing counts, growing them by a growth factor, and adding some nearby trips into it. And that's really the bulk of this scenario. And now I'm ready to actually go in and define my first project scenario. So a little foreshadowing there. We're going to have more than one. All right. Is it foreshadowing if I literally tell you? I don't know. We need some English major to help me remember that. All right, at any rate, what I want to do now is move and create my first project scenario as I'm doing my next step in the transportation impact analysis, and that will prepare us for adding in the trip generation. So I will just come to the scenario manager and simply use this down arrow, which will duplicate this scenario. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll see that creates scenario 3. I'm going to rename that, and I'm going to call this project PM and hit enter. At this point, I do need to remember to left click that scenario in order to be active in that scenario. Now, here's the thing that as someone who gives software demos, it's always a little wrestling. I could show you the simplest way to do this, but it will not help you when you're doing your actual analysis because you're going to have more than one scenario. You're going to have AM, PM, blah, blah, blah. So rather than just simply adding in my new project zone into project scenario 3, which would be the simplest and most straightforward way to do it, I am going to show you the way to do it in Vistro so that it will be available to you under all of your scenarios. This is the way to actually set things up in a real life project. So it reminds me of being in elementary school and having to learn how to do addition and subtraction and of multiple digits, right? Like, you got those everything in the ones column, a piece of cake, and then it starts to get more complicated with the tens and hundreds. And someone who's kind of bright in math and can do stuff in their head, like for a while you're thinking this is nonsense, why do I have to write all this out? And I can do it in my head. And then I remember my elementary teacher telling me, yes, but you're not going to be able to do that forever. The numbers are going to get too big. And sure enough, that's true. So think about it this way. What I'm about to show you is the way to set things up in Vistro so you will be home free as time goes on, even when you have more than one project scenario. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at our special friend, the base scenario. Before I add in my new project information, which by the way, we do in Vistro through something called a zone, I'm going to do that under the base case instead of adding it in under the project case. So I'm going to temporarily toggle back to base. And now that I'm in the base scenario, I'm going to go ahead and click my tool called the zone tool. I'm going to place my zone here in the middle. If you're a demand modeler or had background in that when you're doing these, this is like a mini way of thinking of the same terminology that exists in traditional traffic demand modeling. We're going to have zones, but instead of a whole TIA representing larger parts of a network, it's a site-specific zone. So I've added a zone. It's a purple circle. Normally, if I'm building out my network, I would also need to add a series of gates. Well, in this case, I've already done that. The gates are these blue squares. And the gates generally represent external points on my network where I'm going to have traffic originating from if they're an inbound trip to my zone, or where I'm going to be having traffic terminate at least from the perspective of my study area, for trips that are outbound from my zone. Now, you might have more dense networks or more complicated analyses where you might also put some internal gates. That's a topic for another day. So for now, we have our purple circle zone and our blue square gates. I'm going to zoom back in. Because I've now added that under the base case, that zone's going to be available to me forever in this file. What I'd like to do next is look at trip generation. Yay, we're at the half-hour mark, and this is exactly why you joined. So pay close attention if you haven't been. We're going to go ahead and look at our new integration with the ITE Trip Generation app. What's nice in Vistro, most of our tables look really good in this vertical view, and if you have multiple screens, you can pop them out and have both, full screen on different monitors. But if you don't, you'll want to click the Switch Table Position button, and that will then move my trip generation information because it's the one that's the widest. Some things look better in horizontal than they do vertically. And so that's the case for this table. I'm going to see zone 10, and I might put some information on there like Meadows Apartments. And then at that point, I really want to take advantage of this tie-in to the ITE TripGen11. And there's a couple things you need. In order to get to this point, obviously, you have a PTV Vistro license and you're running in our software. Now, in order to do the next step, which is to actually tie into the ITE Trip Generation database, you also need to have a license of ITE's Trip Generation 11 app. And Pam will share with you ways and links that you can gain access to that if you don't already. But assuming that you do, we're going to take our next step, which is to click this button called ITE TripGen Login. And when I click that, then I get this nice license agreement that reminds me that ITE licenses their own data. I'm accepting their licensing agreement. At this point, what we're doing in Vistro is a connection or an API in order to pull that data. I will acknowledge that and click OK. Then it will take me. Ruffle sleeves, perfect length. I think you're still unmuted, Pam. I'm not sure if you meant to be talking. Then the ITE window here to log in, and this is where you would enter your information that you would get from ITE in terms of your license. Now, once I do this today, it will remember me, right? But not for long. So, you'll log in every once in a while, and that helps to keep everything moving the way it's intended. So I'm going to press, after I put in my username and password, these are credentials from ITE, from my subscription, in this case, your subscription with ITE's TripGen app. Then you will click the login button, and you'll see this nice screen that tells you you're logged in or return to the desktop application now. Well, in this case, PTV Vistro is the desktop application. I'm going to return. And now I see that it doesn't tell me to log in, but if I click this button, it will actually log me out. So just keep that in mind. At this point in time, I want to gain access to ITE's trip rates. I will go to this ITE TripGen column and click the edit field. And now I will be working with the Vistro API for the ITE TripGen 11th edition. And at this point in time, what I will go ahead is search through and look for what code that I would like. So residential, I'm going to do multifamily mid-rise, and then it will think for a minute and give me some more options from the database. We are not close to any rail transit. We are in a general urban suburban. I'm going to do this based on dwelling units. And I am going to put rates in for now of PM peak. Now remember, I'm doing all of this in the base scenario, so it'll be available to me later. If I had AM and PM, it doesn't matter which one I choose right now, just something to get in there. Later on in that specific scenario, I'll go in this once more and refine it if I needed to. Okay, but stick with me. There's a method to my madness, and you'll see that as we go on. Once I have that defined, and I do want my vehicle trips, enter your, this is not the Roman numeral 4, this is IV, independent variable value. And so, it used to be in Vistro, or if you don't use this, you would enter this stuff yourself and you would put that under the quantity field. But in this case, I can enter it right here in this window. I have 80 apartments. And at that point, I can click the calculate button. Then it gives me the option to utilize the results from the average rate or the fitted curve. In this case, they're almost identical. Other land uses, that wouldn't be the case. And whichever one that I choose, then if I click OK, that information will come into this window. Before I do that, I want to show you a couple things. One is there is this link of click description and data plots. If I'm not sure this is the land use that I want to be applying, there's a direct link to that section of the trip generation manual. So I can go ahead and read up on what is this land use? What is it about? What are these, values like? All the things you're used to doing either manually, pun intended, or through the electronic version. So that is available to you. The other thing you can do at this point is the data plot and equation. So I can click that button. And then what I'll see is the results from my specific entries, right? I told it dwelling units, weekday PM peak of adjacent street, not close to rail, and then it will plot out my exact numbers, right? I had 80 units, and then these are my trips. So this is all available to you as well through this connection with ITE's TripGen11 app, and then directly in Vistro. So at this point, I'm happy with this, and I want to proceed with the average rate. I'll click OK. And then we'll see that it fills in and populates that information, what the rate is, what the quantity is, the in and out percentages, and what the trips are. One thing I'll note, we're not going to cover it today in an example, but Vistro's flexible enough to allow you to remove trips as well. So if you are doing an impact analysis for a site that maybe currently has something on it and those trips were reflected in your account data, and your agency allows you to take credit for those, you can actually do a negative trip generation as one zone and put a second zone next to it to represent your project trips. I had one experience in my 17 years of consulting where I was able to do that, and it was along a freeway corridor, and there was a single-story motel that was getting, the project was to demolish the motel at like, I don't know, 30 rooms or something like that and build, like a 100-room hotel. And because the counts were taken when the motel was active, then I was able to do a negative trip gen for taking credit for the motel that was going to be demolished and then layering on the new project in its entirety. Of course, you could, maybe do something off on the side, but it's nice to be able to do it directly in the software. And then later we'll pay attention to this button, the analyze checkbox, and that helps you with our scenario management when these trips are actually going to be brought in to the software. But now that I have my first amount of trip gen in, I'm going to switch my table position back. We're going to speed things up a little bit. I'm sure you'll be able to stick with me on this, but that was the key thing I wanted to make sure we look through. We're going to look through it one more time. If I go to the next step is trip distribution, and so I need to enter, I could name my gates, they would have shown up here, but otherwise, basically this allows me to look at inbound percentages from each of these gates, or outbound percentages to each of these gates. So this is definitely something that, in real life takes a little bit more work than what I'm about to do. But you come up with what these numbers are, you agree with your local jurisdiction, and you go to town after that. So we're going to enter these in real quick, and you can see visually where they are in terms of these distributions. And once I get that going, I'll see that it adds up to 100%. And at this point, I can, if I'm thinking that it's going to be pretty similar in both directions, I can just paste those in. So this starts to give me my inbound and outbound trip distribution. And then the next thing is, there might be more than one way to get between each zone and each gate. So I need to go ahead and do a trip assignment. We have a path tool that allows you to draw all those manually. For the purposes of today's network and example, we're just going to use Vistro's automatic path generation or shortest path algorithm. I'm going to click the add missing paths. And what this is going to do at this point is a couple things. One, we're going to be able to see as I go down this table, all these paths visually that were created for me. And you can see it depends. They may come on the eastern driveway or the western driveway. And in reality, I might want to add some manual paths to have a little bit of traffic to each zone coming in and out of each driveway. We're not going to do that during this webinar, but you can definitely do that in Vistro. One thing I want to point out, the last column, because everything is to scale here, and we know at least the distance from our zone out to our gate, is that we do a VMT calculation. So while it might not be 100% accurate, we don't know where those gates actually end. What it is accurate is for scenario comparison, right? So if each scenario I'm analyzing has the gates in the same location and the zones in the same location, I can look at a differential of VMT between different land uses, for instance, scenarios, that type of thing. So anyway, now at this point, we've basically entered in our trip information, and I'm still in the base scenario. So one last thing that I'm going to want to do, and I know this sounds a little hokey for right now, but believe me, it'll help you, is you uncheck the analyze button, and that makes sure that it doesn't end up putting those trips in under my existing PM or my near-term PM. Then I just come back to my project scenario and I click that project scenario. Once it thinks about that and puts that in, then I'm gonna switch my position again. And now for my project scenario, that's where I want these trips to actually happen. So I just come back and click that button to analyze it. Now those trips will show up just in scenario 3, but it's available to me for any other new scenario that I might build. At this point in time, I can see things like my trip assignment on each of my intersections. So if I now were to look at my intersection results here, my delays and level of service, and maybe I just go ahead and show the delay values, it gets a little bit tough depending on the scale of your network and so forth, but we can start to see maybe how certain intersections are operating. But the other thing I can do is see that data in my HCM results here. But what I can then see is also my different volumes. So if I have what is my net new site trips. So these are the new trips by turning movements that are attributed just to this project. And we have different reports that will show those to you in tabular form and even calculate out and graphical form and show you the percentages as well as the hard numbers. So that is essentially the process of getting a first project in. Now you might have more complex projects and you might obviously want to look and see places where you might need to do some mitigations. What I'm going to suggest that we do here real quick, let's turn this off. I'm just going to save this. And the next thing that I'm going to do, if we notice this trip gen, I might have a scenario where I'm adding this project in, but I may also have a scenario where I need to add in another project's worth of data. And so I want to do this to highlight the usage of the ITE Trip app connection, and also then to look at evaluating the intersections once I have more data, more traffic in the network. So this is a site, if you're a long-time webinar watcher, you've seen us do a TIA of this Family Fun Center and pad properties. Well, it's been 2 years, and guess what? Only the main fun center has been built. There's still the need to add in other trips for other uses. And I want to highlight now, if I want to add another scenario, I can duplicate the one that I just created, and I can call this one that includes project site A and B. And if I want to do preparation for that, I'm going to do this way faster. I have that created. I go to my base scenario. I add in a zone for my retail. I add in a zone for my fast food. And then I go to my trip generation table, switch my position. I come into the, I logged out, darn it. Okay, log in. Let's do this one more time, and then you get to see it. Okay, actually I meant to do this, right? This is so you can see the process one more time. I jest, of course. I'm logged in now for zone 2. For the moment, we can uncheck zone 1. That's fine. This is where I might do something like, pick up my next option, and maybe I do something like variety store. And then I can go through similar things, all sites, suburban, 1,000 square feet, PM peak hour 4 to 6, vehicle, and I'm gonna do, let's say 20,000 square feet. Calculate, see my rates, add them in, and then I'm also going to do my next and last one, which is gonna be a fast food. And let's do fast food with drive-through. And 1,000 square feet. And PM peak. Whoop, that's AM. That won't help me. PM peak. And then I'm going to do that at about 2,400 square feet. Calculate that. Of course, remember, I can always look again and see where this is on my plot and so forth. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And now I have all of that data. And all I need to do now is switch my table position and add in, I've already got my percentages for my retail. And of course, I might have different percentages for this, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna put the same distribution percentages in. I might make them differently for retail and fast food than I did for residential in real life. But really, once I have those in, The last thing I need to do is come here and add my new paths for these two sites. I can do that with an add missing paths button. And now I'll have traffic, let's see, zone, origin, and let's do 11. And if I look here, then as I toggle down, we'll see all of the different paths that are available to me to and from that site and what their trips and VMT are. And then lastly, so that it doesn't apply it to existing conditions, I'm going to uncheck these three. Then I'm going to toggle, go back to my scenario 3 just to show you something. When I'm in my single project scenario, I only have that project active, but my other data is available to me. But I uncheck it. And then when I go to my project my scenario where I'm including all 3 zones, that's when I would come just in this scenario and I would check those to be analyzed and active for those 2 new zones I put in. And now under this scenario, I'm going to have all 3 of these project trips. So you can, through that, hopefully get a feel for what it's like to be able to mix and match your zones by scenario. And then, of course, at that point in time, we can maybe look to mitigate if we have any problems. And so one quick way to do that is visually instead of having to pour through your reports. So maybe I do a quick level of service visual, and I can see level of service F, E, F, etc. You know, a lot of times with these two-way stops, it'll show F because the side street movements are really poor, but it's not going to meet signal warrants, and that's the case here. Maybe I can go in and add an extra right turn pocket or something like that. That's a possibility. If I go back to my intersection control here, I can see how that intersection is analyzing. But one thing I might do, let's look at this intersection over here, which is currently a two-way stop. Knowing from running the report, this actually does meet signal warrants. And so I want to highlight our mitigation tool. If you click the mitigation button, first I see a brief form of how the intersection is operating right now as unmitigated. But I simply click this button and that gives me an option. And the option, this is like a scratch pad. I can come in here and I can try out what if I change lane stripings, what if I do this, that, or the other thing. In this case, I'm gonna just switch this to be a signal and put in some basic information. I'm just gonna say it's 2-phase, and I'm gonna use our tool that helps me create that automatically. And then I have my NEMA numbering, and everything else in this area is run a 90-second cycle. So I'm just going to modify that. And since it's a planning level study, I'm going to say, hey, use the volume to capacity ratio to balance out my splits. So I'm going to click OK. And then at that point, it'll show me I was level service F, but now I can get it to B as a signal. I know that's not always an option. I know adding a lane is not always an option, but all of those types of things can be tested. Even for instance, if I wanted a second scenario here where instead of making it signal, I leave it two-way stop, but maybe I do try to change my lane striping to have a little wider approach eastbound and westbound. I can try that out and see, you know, my worst case was 191 before, and now it's 111. So I got some improvement, but not enough to actually, you know, improve that intersection. And I can always rename these things here, which is like two-way stop with more lanes. And option 1 is not liking me. All right, well, I should be, there we go. Double click, Bill, double click, signalize. So what I have now available to me are some stored options. This is great when you work in teams because perhaps you have somebody who's going to test out a bunch of different mitigation options and then meet with their project manager later to go over which one makes the most sense. And so these can be printed directly. The other alternative is I can make a whole new scenario, duplicate the scenario, call it mitigated, and then modify it directly in the standard traffic control phase table. Sorry. So at any rate, the last thing I think that I didn't quite fit on is this concept of 11th hour changes have met their match. And this last thing I'm going to talk about here live is just to show that, let's say I am working on a project and I'm almost out of my budget. And my developer friend calls me up and says, Bill, great news, excellent news. We have figured out that we can get 30,000 square feet of variety store instead of 20,000 square feet. And I tell him, thank you very much, but that was step 2 out of 10, and I'm almost out of budget. And then he reminds me that he may never hire me again unless I do this within the budget. So then I say, thank God I have Vistro. I can do the quantity field, and I can change that 20 to a 30. I can hit tab. We'll see right now I have 134 trips. That goes up to 201, but guess what? Because I have my distribution integrated and my trip assignment integrated, all of my level of service calculations have now been modified as a result of that, and I can proceed at that point with any other mitigations. Or you can use it as testing what ifs, right? If you're really working early on with a developer and they want to look at what the traffic impacts are for different types of land uses, you can use this type of options, and you can make new scenarios of it too, right? Scenarios with a certain type of land use or a different type or whatever. At any rate, I know it all depends on what type of project work you do, but it does make life very easy to be able to modify once things are set up. So we spend a little bit of time on the front end, and it's going to prepare us and benefit us for the life of this model. All right, well, with that, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to shift back to the PowerPoint and start to answer some questions. The only other thing that I need to do for Truth in Advertising is show this slide, which is that in the HCM 7th, we now can model CAV rates, different market penetration rates at signals and roundabouts, and how that would affect the analysis. And we also made some updates to the two-way stop method. So that's just to keep you up to date on that. Pam, I'm going to go ahead and do you want to start off while I look through some of these? Okay.
Yep, I will go ahead, and I just want to make a couple of preface comments. You all may have seen this in the chat feature. If you haven't checked out the chat, please do so. There's some good information in there. There are the links that both Bill and I have referenced. First of all, Bill will not be speaking to specific competitive products. He will make general references. Also, I know that we're getting short on time. So if he is not able to answer all the questions here, he will follow up with you directly via email after the presentation. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Pam, I'm sorry, but I also am realizing for some reason in my GoToWebinar, I am not seeing the Q&A.
Oh,
I only see the chat. Yeah.
Let me see if I can fix that for you. I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question while I'm fixing that, so we don't have to hold people up. The first question is, what analysis methodology is used for non-NEMA signals?
Yeah. So we're using the highway capacity manual methodology for the non-NEMA signals. Basically, you can, okay, so I'm not mentioning competitors' products, but I will say that there's a competitor that will tell you that it can't analyze certain things because the HCM can't analyze certain things. And it's very frustrating for somebody on the highway capacity committee because it also leads to people then telling me, you know what, the HCM can't analyze this.
Oh, hang on for a second.
The HCM does have that. So at any rate, what we do is, I meant to go to this screen. You can, it breaks everything down into the movement groups and phasing that occur, and then applies HCM methodologies from there. So if we look briefly here at a signalized intersection and go to my signal table, we are using NEMA numbering here, and this is a pretty standard intersection. But as I was mentioning, our ring and barrier controller can have 4 rings and 8 barriers, and you can define these numbering however that you want them to be. They do not have to follow the NEMA convention, as long as they're, you can't put ABC, but as long as they have a number, and then you coordinate between your definition of that signal group in terms of what movement it relates to, and what type of protected or permissive operations or overlap operations. And then you put them into sequence in what we call our sequence editor, which is basically our phasing diagram, where you have the barriers are these thicker lines that you can put in. And for instance, if I wanted to add PED only phase number 29, and I gave it a little bit of green time and a little bit of yellow, clearance time of, something like that, then I can put that phase into sequence here, and I can just quickly redo my split, and there we have it, right? So it's essentially the interaction of that type of defining a signal group or phase number by movement, putting them into sequence in the phase sequence editor, and then what the HCM cares about is how much green time, what the SAT flows are, and how much green per cycle those movement groups are getting, and then it continues downward from there, right, into delays and queuing and so forth. So sorry for the longer explanation, but that's the answer to that. You can always shoot me an email after the fact as well, bill.cisco@ptvgroup.com. And I will also follow up with any other questions we don't get to during this live portion. All right, let me see, Pam, am I able to see those now? I can, okay, great.
Can you? Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to just a second and scroll through them?
Yep. All right. So we do have the interactions between Vistro and our other products. So there's a few questions in there that relate to what if you're doing this, can it then be used in vSim or Vizum, which is our demand modeling software, since those are all PTV products, and the questions list them by name. I will answer to say, yes, we will be able to, we can give you a more thorough answer later on, but all of these are able to work well together. There's even a simulation previewer. If you do not own vSim, I can convert this with only a Vistro license and start to see the simulation. I just can't modify or calibrate that simulation or record the animation without having the vSim license. Can you bring a competitor's project into Vistro? Yes, we have file imports from some competitors, or even our value format is through a lot of CSV data. So as long as it's in our defined format, those can be imported in. There's some questions here. Okay, in the multifamily housing example, can you show how you would adjust the number of units? So I think that was probably entered before I showed it for the other example, but basically any adjustments that you make, you can go back to any of the scenarios that have that value and modify the land use quantity in the trip generation field. I'm just gonna scroll instead of showing the other view, and I can modify the quantity, say from 80 to 100 and hit tab. And again, I just need to keep track. If I did it here, it only applies to scenario 4. If I also want that in scenario 3, I can do it there, or I can go all the way back to the base and do it there, and then it'll apply everywhere that it's checked. So there's some nuances there. You can model U-turns in Vistro. That's a very good question too, in terms of traffic modeling. What you do in the lane striping and traffic control phase is as you're defining your turns, you can click this plus button, and that can, instead of a left, you can pick a left and U, or just a U if you have a case where all they can do is U-turn. In this case, this northbound, if I look here, and then I click here, I can see that it's this approach, and I can reduce out my left and make it a left with a U. And why that is important is it adds a column for U-turn volume data. So what's nice about that is you can keep track of your U-turn volumes separately from your left turn volumes. And even when you do project trip assignments with those paths, if you have roadways that have hard divider, yeah, I'm a civil engineer. What are they called again? Median barriers or whatever it is. Then you might have to route trips that include U-turns, right? And so you can do that with your paths. Vistro will keep track of those by specifically the U-turn. When it comes time to analyze it in the HCM treats these as a left turn, so it would combine those two together to run the analysis. So good question. And I
Hey,
think I'm
Bill,
running out of time. Yep.
yeah, so Bill, so we are at the top of the hour, and I can tell by the number of attendees that people are definitely having to jump to other commitments. So I think at this point, it's probably best for us to wrap up. But like Bill and I both said, I do have a report of all the questions, and Bill will follow up with you individually following this webinar. It may be tomorrow or Monday, but he will get to you. And I do appreciate all the time that you have spent today listening to this product showcase by PTV, and I'd like to thank Bill especially for this informative webinar. I look forward to seeing all of you on a future one. Bill, any wrap-up words?
No, I just say thank you very much for your questions and for your attention and being interested, and please reach out to me up in my email there, and I'll also follow up directly with the Q&A.
All right, wonderful, everyone. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.